Part 2. The Quality of Landscape. Wisconsin. Marshland Elegy. A dawn wind stirs on the great marsh. With almost imperceptible slowness, it rolls a bank of fog across the wide morass. Like the white ghost of a glacier, the mists advance, riding over phalanxes of tamarack, sliding across bog meadows heavy with dew. A single silence hangs from horizon to horizon. Out of some far recess of the sky, a tinkling of little bells falls soft upon the listening land. Then again, silence. Now comes a baying of some sweet-throated hound, soon the clamor of a responding pack. Then a far, clear blast of hunting horns out of the sky into the fog. High horns, low horns, silence, and finally a pandemonium of trumpets, rattles, croaks, and cries that almost shakes the bog with its nearness, but without yet disclosing whence it comes. At last, a glint of sun reveals the approach of a great echelon of birds. On motionless wings they emerge from the lifting mists, sweep a final arc of sky, and settle in dangerous descending spirals to their feeding grounds. A new day has begun on the Crane Marsh. A sense of time lies thick and heavy on such a place. Yearly, since the Ice Age, it has awakened each spring to the clangor of cranes. The peat layers that comprise the bog are laid down in the basin of an ancient lake. The cranes stand, as it were, upon the sodden pages of their own history. These peats are the compressed remains of the mosses that clogged the pools, of the tamaracks that spread over the moss, of the cranes that bulged over the tamaracks since the retreat of the ice sheet. An endless caravan of generations has built of its own bones the bridge into the future, this habitat where the oncoming host again may live and breed and die. To what end? Out on the bog, a crane, gulping some luckless frog, springs his ungainly hulk into the air and flails the morning sun with mighty wings. The tamaracks re-echo with his bulged certitude. He seems to know. Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It extends through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. The quality of cranes lies, I think, in this higher gamut, as yet beyond the reach of words. This much, though, can be said. Our appreciation of the crane grows with the slow unraveling of earthly history. His tribe, we now know, stems out of the remote Eocene. The other members of the fauna in which he originated are long since entombed within the hills. When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. He is the symbol of our untamable past, of the incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. And so they live and have their being, these cranes, not in the constricted presence, but in the wider reaches of evolutionary time. Their annual return is the ticking of the geologic clock. Upon the place of their return, they confer a peculiar distinction. Amid the endless mediocrity of the commonplace, a crane marsh holds a paleontological patent of nobility, one in the march of eons, and irrevocable only by shotgun. The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps, from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history. Some sense of this quality in cranes seems to have been felt by sportsmen and ornithologists of all ages. Upon such quarry as this, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick loosed his gyrfalcons. Upon such quarry as this once swooped the hawks of Kubla Khan. Marco Polo tells us, he derives the highest amusement from sporting with gyrfalcons and hawks. At Changnor, the Khan has a great palace surrounded by a fine plain where are found cranes in great numbers. He causes millet and other grains to be sown in order that the birds may not want. The ornithologist Bennett Berg, seeing cranes as a boy upon the Swedish heaths, forthwith made them his life work. He followed them to Africa and discovered their winter retreat on the White Nile. He says of his first encounter, it was a spectacle which eclipsed the flight of the rock in the 1,001 nights. When the glacier came down out of the north, crunching hills and gouging valleys, some adventuring rampart of the ice climbed the Baraboo Hills and fell back into the outlet gorge of the Wisconsin River. The swollen waters backed up and formed a lake half as long as the state, bordered on the east by cliffs of ice and fed by the torrents that fell from melting mountains. The shorelines of this old lake are still visible. Its bottom is the bottom of the great marsh. The lake rose through the centuries, finally spilling over east of the Baraboo Range. There is cut a new channel for the river, and thus drained itself. To the residual lagoons came the cranes, bulging the defeat of the retreating winter, summoning the on-creeping host of living things to their collective task of marsh building. Floating bogs of sphagnum moss clogged the lower waters, filling them. Sedge and leatherleaf, tamarack and spruce successively advanced over the bog, anchor it by their root fabric, sucking out its water, making peat. The lagoons disappeared, but not the cranes. To the moss meadows that replaced the ancient waterways they returned each spring to dance and bugle and rear their gangling, sorrel-colored young. These, albeit birds, are not properly called chicks, but colts. I cannot explain why. On some dewy June morning, watch them gambol over their ancestral pastures at the heels of the roan mare, and you will see for yourself. One year, not long ago, a French trapper in buckskins pushed his canoe up one of the moss-clogged creeks that thread the great marsh. At this attempt to invade their miry stronghold, the cranes gave vent to loud and ribald laughter. A century or two later, Englishmen came in covered wagons. They chopped clearings in the timbered moraines that border the marsh, and in them planted corn and buckwheat. They did not intend, like the great Khan at Changanore, to feed the cranes, but the cranes did not question the intent of glaciers, emperors, or pioneers. They ate the grain, and when some irate farmer failed to concede their usufruct in his corn, they trumpeted a warning and sailed across the marsh to another farm. There was no alfalfa in those days, and the hill farms made poor hayland, especially in dry years. One dry year, someone set a fire in the tamaracks. The burn grew up quickly to blue-joint grass, which, when cleansed of dead trees, made a dependable hay meadow. After that, each August, men appeared to cut hay. in winter. After the cranes had gone south, they drove wagons over the frozen bog and hauled the hay to their farms in the hills. Yearly they plied the marsh with fire and axe, and in 2 short decades hay meadows dotted the whole expanse. Each August, when the haymakers came to pitch their camps, singing and drinking, and lashing their teams with whip and tongue, the cranes whinnied to their colts and retreated to their far fastness. Red shite pokes, the haymakers called them, from the rusty hue which at that season often stains the battleship gray of crane plumage. After the hay was stacked and the marsh again their own, the cranes returned to call down out of October skies the migrant flocks from Canada. Together they wheeled over the new-cut stubbles and raided the corn until frosts gave the signal for the winter exodus. These hay-meadow days were the Arcadian age for the marsh dwellers. Man and beast, plant and soil, lived on and with each other in mutual toleration, to the mutual benefit of all. The marsh might have kept on producing hay and prairie chickens, deer and muskrat, crane music, and cranberries forever. The new overlords did not understand this. They did not include soil, plants, or birds in their ideas of mutuality. The dividends of such a balanced economy were too modest. They envisaged farms not only around, but in the marsh. An epidemic of ditch digging and land booming set in. The marsh was gridironed with drainage canals, speckled with new fields and farmsteads. But crops were poor and beset by frosts, to which the expensive ditches added an aftermath of debt. Farmers moved out. Peat beds dried, shrank, caught fire. Sun energy out of the Pleistocene shrouded the countryside in acrid smoke. No man raised his voice against the waste, only his nose against the smell. After a dry summer, not even the winter snows could extinguish the smoldering marsh. Grey pock marks were burned into field and meadow, the scars reaching down to the sands of the old lake, peat-covered these 100 centuries. Rank weeds sprang out of the ashes, to be followed after a year or two by aspen scrub. The cranes were hard put, their numbers shrinking with the remnants of unburned meadow. For them, the song of the power shovel came near being an elegy. The high priests of progress knew nothing of the cranes, and cared less. What is a species more or less among engineers? What good is an undrained marsh anyhow? For a decade or two, crops grew poorer, fires deeper, wood fields larger, and cranes scarcer, year by year. Only reflooding, it appeared, could keep the peat from burning. Meanwhile, cranberry growers had, by plugging drainage ditches, reflooded a few spots and obtained good yields. Distant politicians bungled about marginal land, overproduction, unemployment, relief, conservation. Economists and planners came to look at the marsh. Surveyors, technicians, CCCs buzzed about. A counter-epidemic of reflooding set in. Government bought land, resettled farmers, plugged ditches wholesale. Slowly, the bogs are re-wetting. The firepocks become ponds. Grass fires still burn, but they can no longer burn the wetted soil. All this, once the CCC camps were gone, was good for cranes, but not so the thickets of scrub popple that spread inexorably over the burns, and still less the maze of new roads that inevitably follow governmental conservation. To build a road is so much simpler than to think of what the country really needs. A roadless marsh is seemingly as worthless to the alphabetical conservationists as the undrained one was to the empire builders. Solitude, the one natural resource still undowered of alphabets, is so far recognized as valuable only by ornithologists and cranes. Thus always does history, whether of marsh marketplace and in paradox. The ultimate value in these marshes is wildness, and the crane is wildness incarnate. But all conservation of wildness is self-defeating. For the cherish we must see and fondle, and when enough have seen and fondled, there is no wilderness left to cherish. Some day, perhaps in the very process of our benefactions, perhaps in the fullness of geologic time, the last crane will trumpet his farewell and spiral skyward from the great marsh. High out of the clouds will fall the sound of hunting horns, the baying of the phantom pack, the tinkle of little bells, and then a silence will never be broken, unless perchance in some far pasture of the Milky Way. The Sand Counties. Every profession keeps a small herd of epithets, and needs a pasture where they may run at large. Thus economists must find free range somewhere for their pet aspersions, such as submarginality, regression, and institutional rigidity. Within the ample reaches of the Sand Counties, these economic terms of reproach find beneficial exercise. Free pasturage and immunity from the gadflies of critical rebuttal. Soil experts, likewise, would have a hard life without the Sand Counties. Where else would their podzoles, glaze, and anaerobics find a living? Social planners have, of late years, come to use the Sand Counties for a different, albeit somewhat parallel purpose. The sandy region serves as a pale, blank area of pleasing shape and size, on whose polka dot maps, where each dot represents 10 bathtubs, or 5 women's auxiliaries, or 1 mile of blacktop, or a share in a blooded bull. Such maps would become monotonous if stippled uniformly. In short, the Sand Counties are poor. Yet in the 1930s, when the alphabetical uplifts galloped like 40 horsemen across the big flats, exhorting the sand farmers to resettle elsewhere, these benighted folk did not want to go, even when baited with 3% at the Federal Land Bank. I began to wonder why, and finally, to settle the question, I bought myself a sand farm. Sometimes in June, when I see unearned dividends of dew hung on every lupine, I have doubts about the real poverty of the sands. On solvent farmlands, lupines do not even grow, much less collect a daily rainbow of jewels. If they did, the weed control officer, who seldom sees a dewy dawn, would doubtless insist that they be cut. Do economists know about lupines? Perhaps the farmers who did not want to move out of the Sand Counties had some deep reason, rooted far back in history, for preferring to stay. I am reminded of this every April when the pasque flowers bloom on every gravelly ridge. Pasques do not say much, but I infer that their presence harks back to the glacier that put the gravel there. Only gravel ridges are poor enough to offer pasques full elbow room in April sun. They endure snows, sleets, and bitter winds for the privilege of blooming alone. There are other plants who seem to ask of this world not riches, but room. Such is the little sandwort that throws a white lace cap over the poorest hilltops just before the lupines splash them with blue. Sandworts simply refuse to live on a good farm, even on a very good farm, complete with rock garden and begonias. And then there is the little linaria, so small, so slender, and so blue that you don't even see it until it is directly underfoot. Whoever saw a linaria except on a sand blow? Finally, there is Draba, beside whom even linaria is tall and ample. I have never met an economist who knows draba, but if I were one I should do all my economic pondering lying prone on the sand with draba at nose length. There are birds that are found only in the sand counties, for reasons some easy, some difficult to guess. The clay-colored sparrow is there, for the clear reason that he is enamored of jackpines, and jackpines of sand. The sandhill crane is there for the clear reason that he is enamored of solitude, and there is none left elsewhere. But why do woodcocks prefer to nest in the sandy regions? Their preference is rooted in no such mundane matter as food, for earthworms are far more abundant on better soil. After years of study, I now think I know the reason. The male woodcock, while doing his painting prologue to the sky dance, is like a short lady in high heels. He does not show up to advantage in dense, tangled ground cover, but on the porous sand streak of the poorest pasture or meadow of the sand counties, there is, in April at least, no ground cover at all, save only moss, draba, cardamine, sheep sorrel, and antennaria, all negligible impediments to a bird with short legs. Here the male woodcock can puff and strut and mince, and only without let or hindrance, but in full view of his audience, real or hoped for. This little circumstance, important for only an hour a day, for only 1 month of the year, perhaps for only one of the two sexes, and certainly wholly irrelevant to economic standards of living, determine the woodcock's choice of a home. The economists have not yet tried to resettle woodcocks. Odyssey. X has marked time in the limestone ledge since the Paleozoic seas covered the land. Time, to an atom locked in a rock, does not pass. The break came when a bur oak, root nose down a crack, and began prying and sucking. In the flash of a century, the rock decayed, and X was pulled out and up into the world of living things. He helped build a flower, which became an acorn, which fattened a deer, which fed an Indian, all in a single year. From his birth in the Indian's bones, X joined again in chase and flight, feast and famine, hope and fear. He felt these things as changes in the little chemical pushes and pulls that tugged timelessly at every atom. When the Indian took his leave of the prairie, X mouldered briefly underground, only to embark on a second trip through the bloodstream of the land. This time it was a rootlet of blue stem that sucked him up and lodged him in a leaf that rode the green billows of the prairie June, sharing the common task of hoarding sunlight. To this leaf also fell an uncommon task, flicking shadows across a plover's eggs. The ecstatic plover, hovering overhead, poured praises on something perfect. Perhaps the eggs, perhaps the shadows, or perhaps the haze of pink flocks that lay on the prairie. When the departing plovers set wing for the Argentine, all the blossoms waved farewell with tall new tassels. When the first geese came out of the north, and all the blue stems glowed wine red, a four-handed deer mouse cut the leaf in which X lay, and buried it in an underground nest, as if to hide a bit of Indian summer from the thriving frosts. But a fox detained the mouse. Molds and fungi took the nest part, and X lay in the soil again, footloose and fancy-free. Next entered a tuft of side oats grama, a buffalo chip, and again the soil. Next a spiderwort, a rabbit, and an owl. Thence a tuft of sporobolus. All routines come to an end. This one ended with a prairie fire, which reduced the prairie plants to smoke, gas, and ashes. Phosphorus and potash atoms stayed in the ash, but the nitrogen atoms were gone with the wind. A spectator might, at this point, have predicted an early end to the biotic drama, for with fires exhausting the nitrogen, the soil might well have lost its plants and blown away. But the prairie has two strings to its bow. Fires thinned its grasses, but they thickened its stand of leguminous herbs, prairie clover, bush clover, wild bean vetch, lead plant, trefoil, and baptisa, each carrying its own bacteria housed in nodules on its rootlets. Each nodule pumped nitrogen out of the air, into the plant, and then ultimately into the soil. Thus the Prairie Savings Bank took in more nitrogen from its legumes than it paid out to its fires. That the prairie is rich is known to the humblest deer mouse. Why the prairie is rich is a question seldom asked in all the still lapse of ages. Between each of his excursions through the biota, X lay in the soil and was carried by the rains, inch by inch, downhill. Living plants retarded the wash by impounding atoms, dead plants by locking them to their decaying tissues. Animals ate the plants and carried them briefly uphill or downhill, depending on whether they died or defecated higher or lower than they fed. No animal was aware that the altitude of his death was more important than the manner of dying. Thus, a fox caught a gopher in a meadow, carried X uphill to his bed on a brow of a ledge, where an eagle laid him low. The dying fox sensed the end of his chapter in foxdom, but not the new beginning in the Odyssey of an atom. An Indian eventually inherited the eagle's plumes, and with them propitiated the fates, whom he assumed had a special interest in Indians. It did not occur to him that they might be busy casting dice against gravity, that mice and men, soil and songs might be merely ways to retard the march of atoms to the sea. One year, while X lay in a cottonwood by the river, he was eaten by a beaver, an animal that always feeds higher than he dies. The beaver starved when his pond dried up during a bitter frost. X rode the carcass down the spring freshet, losing more altitude each hour than heretofore in a century. He ended up in the silt of a backwater bayou, where he fed a crayfish, a coon, and then an Indian, who laid him down to his last sleep in a mound on a riverbank. One spring, an oxbow caved the bank, and after one short week of freshet, X lay again in his ancient prison, the sea. An atom at large in the biota is too free to know freedom. An atom back in the sea has forgotten it. For every atom lost to the sea, the prairie pulls another out of the decaying rocks. The only certain truth is that its creatures must suck hard, live fast, and die often, lest it loses its losses exceed its gains. It is the nature of roots to nose into cracks. When Y was thus released from the parent ledge, a new animal had arrived and begun redding up the prairie to fit its own notions of law and order. An ox team turned the prairie sod, and Y began a succession of dizzy annual trips through a new grass called wheat. The old prairie lived by the diversity of its plants and animals, all of which were useful because the sum total of their cooperations and competitions achieved continuity. But the wheat farmer was a builder of categories. To him only wheat and oxen were useful. He saw the useless pigeons settle in clouds upon his wheat and shortly cleared the skies of them. He saw the cinch bugs take over the stealing job and fume because here was a useless thing too small to kill. He failed to see the downward wash of overweeded loam laid bare in spring against the pelting rains. When soil wash and cinch bugs finally put an end to wheat farming, Y and his like had already traveled far down the watershed. When the empire of wheat collapsed, the settler took a leaf from the old prairie book. He impounded his fertility in livestock. He augmented it with nitrogen-pumping alfalfa, and he tapped the lower layers of loam with deep-rooted corn. But he used his alfalfa and every other new weapon against wash, not only to hold his old plowings, but also to exploit new ones, which, in turn, needed holding. So despite alfalfa, the black loam grew gradually, thinner. Erosion engineers built dams and terraces to hold it. Army engineers built levees and wing dams to flush it from the rivers. The rivers would not flush, but raised their beds instead, thus choking navigation. So the engineers built pools like gigantic beaver ponds, and Y landed in one of these. His trip from rock to river completed in one short century. On first meeting the pool, Y made several trips through water plants, fish, and waterfowl, but engineers built sewers as well as dams, and down them comes the loot of all the far hills in the sea. The atoms that once grew pasque flowers to greet the returning plovers now lie inert, confused, imprisoned in oily sludge. Root still knows among the rocks. Rain still pelt the fields. Deer mice still hide their souvenirs of Indian summer. Old men who helped destroy the pigeons still recount the glory of the fluttering hosts. Black and white buffalo pass in and out of red barns, offering free rides to itinerant atoms. On a monument to the pigeons. We have erected a monument to commemorate the funeral of a species. It symbolizes our sorrow. We grieve because no living man will see again the onrushing phalanx of victorious birds, sweeping a path for spring across the marsh skies, chasing the defeated winter from all the woods and prairies of Wisconsin. Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live who in their youth were shaken by a living wind, but a decade hence only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last only the hills will know. There will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images dead to all hardships and to all delights. Book pigeons cannot dive out of a cloud to make the deer run for cover or clap their wings in thunderous applause of mast-laden woods. Book pigeons cannot breakfast on new-mown wheat in Minnesota and dine on blueberries in Canada. They know no urge of seasons. They feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live forever by not living at all. Our grandfathers were less well-housed, well-fed, well-clothed than we are. The strivings by which they bettered their lot are also those which deprived us of pigeons. Perhaps we now grieve because we are not sure in our hearts that we have gained by the exchange. The gadgets of industry bring us more comfort than the pigeons did, but do they add as much to the glory of the spring? It is a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of the species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan of generations, that men are only fellow voyagers with other creatures in the Odyssey of evolution. This new knowledge should have given us, by this time, a sense of kinship with fellow creatures, a wish to live and let live, a sense of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise. Above all, we should, in the century since Darwin, have come to know that men, while now captain of the adventuring ship, is hardly the sole object of its quest, and that his prior assumptions to this effect arose from the simple necessity of whistling in the dark. These things, I say, should have come to us. I fear they have not come to many. For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. The Cro-Magnon who slew the last mammoths thought only of steaks. The sportsman who shot the last pigeon thought only of his prowess. The sailor who clubbed the last auk thought of nothing at all. But we who have lost our pigeons mourn the loss. Had the funeral been ours, the pigeons would hardly have mourned us. In this fact, rather than in Mr. DuPont's nylons or Mr. Vanier Bush's bombs, lie objective evidence of our superiority over the beasts. This monument, perched like a duck-hawk on this cliff, will scan this wide valley, watching through the days and years. For many a march it will watch the geese go by, telling the river about clearer, colder, lonelier waters on the tundra. For many an April it will see the redbuds come and go, and for many a May the flush of oak blooms on 1,000 hills. Questing wood ducks will search these basswoods for hollow limbs. Golden prothonotarians will shake golden pollen from the river willows. Egrets will pose on the sloughs in August. Plovers will whistle from September skies. Hickory nuts will plop into October leaves, and hail will rattle in November woods. But no pigeons will pass, for there are no pigeons, save only this flightless one, graven in bronze on this rock. Tourists will read this inscription, but their thoughts will not take wing. We are told by economic moralists that to mourn the pigeon is mere nostalgia, that if the pigeoners had not done away with them, the farmers would ultimately have been obliged in self-defense to do so. This is one of those peculiar truths that are valid, but not for the reasons alleged. The pigeon was a biological storm. He was the lightning that played between two opposing potentials of intolerable intensity, the fat of the land and the oxygen of the air. Yearly the feathered tempest roared up, down, and across the continent, sucking up the laden fruits of forest and prairie, burning them in a traveling blast of life. Like any other chain reaction, the pigeon could survive no diminution of his own furious intensity. When the pigeoners subtracted from his numbers, and the pioneers chopped gaps in the continuity of his fuel, his flame guttered out, with hardly a sputter or even a wisp of smoke. Today the oaks still flaunt their burden at the sky, but the feathered lightning is no more. Worm and weevil must now perform slowly and silently the biological task that once drew thunder from the firmament. The wonder is not that the pigeon went out, but that he ever survived through all the millennia of pre-Babyscian times. The pigeon loved his land. He lived by the intensity of his desire for clustered grape and bursting beechnut, and by his contempt for miles and seasons. Whatever Wisconsin did not offer him gratis today, he sought and found tomorrow in Michigan, or Labrador, or Tennessee. His love was for present things, and these things were present somewhere. To find them required only the free sky and the will to ply his wings. To love what was is a new thing under the sun, unknown to most people and to all pigeons. To see America as history, to conceive of destiny as becoming, to smell the hickory tree through the still lapse of ages. All these things are possible for us, and to achieve them takes only the free sky and the will to ply our wings. In these things, and not in Mr. Bush's bombs and Mr. DuPont's nylons, lie the objective evidence of our own superiority over the beasts. Flambeau. People who have never canoed in a wild river, or have done so only with a guide in the stern, are apt to assume that novelty plus healthful exercise account for the value of the trip. I thought so too, until I met two college boys on the Flambeau. Supper dishes washed, we sat on the bank watching a buck dunking for water plants on the far shore. Soon the buck raised his head, cocked his ears upstream, and then bounded for cover. Around the bend came the cause of his alarm, two boys in a canoe. Spying us, they edged in to pass the time of day. "What time was it?" was their first question. They explained that their watches had run down, and for the first time in their lives there was no clock, whistle, or radio to set watches by. For 2 days they had lived by sun time, and were getting a thrill out of it. No servant brought them meals. They got their meat out of the river, or went without. No traffic cop whistled them off the hidden rock in the next rapids. No friendly roof kept them dry when they misguessed whether or not to pitch the tent. No guide showed them which camping spots offered a night-long breeze and which a night-long misery of mosquitoes, which firewood made clean coals, and which only smoke. Before our young adventurers pushed off downstream, we learned that both were slated for the army upon the conclusion of the trip. Now the motif was clear. The trip was their first and last taste of freedom, an interlude between two regimentations, the campus and the barracks. The elemental simplicities of wilderness travel were thrills not only because of their novelty, but because they represented complete freedom to make mistakes. The wilderness gave them their first taste of those rewards and penalties for wise and foolish acts which every woodsman faces daily, but against which civilization has built 1,000 buffers. These boys were on their own in this particular sense. Perhaps every youth needs an occasional wilderness trip in order to learn the meaning of this particular freedom. When I was a small boy, my father used to describe all choice camps, fishing waters, and woods as nearly as good as the Flambeau. When I finally launched my own canoe in this legendary stream, I found it up to expectations as a river, but as a wilderness it was on its last legs. New cottages, resorts, and highway bridges were chopping up the wild stretches into shorter and shorter segments. To run down the Flambeau was to be mentally whipsawed between alternating impressions. No sooner had you built up the mental illusion of being in the wilds than you sighted a boat landing, and soon you were coasting past some cottagers' peonies. Safely past the peonies, a buck bounding up the bank helped us to restore the wilderness flavor, and the next rapids finished the job. But staring at you beside the pool below was a synthetic log cabin, complete with composition roof, bide-a-wee signboard, and rustic pergola for afternoon bridge. Paul Bunyan was too busy a man to think about posterity, but if he had asked to reserve a spot for posterity to see what the old North Woods looked like, he likely would have chosen the Flambeau. For here the cream of the white pine grew on the same acres with the cream of the sugar maple, yellow birch, and hemlock. This rich intermixture of pine and hardwoods was, and is, uncommon. The Flambeau pines, growing on a hardwood soil richer than pines are ordinarily able to occupy, were so large and valuable, and so close to a good log-driving stream that they were cut at an early day, as evidenced by the decaying conditions of their giant stumps. Only defective pines were spared, but there are enough of these alive today to punctuate the skyline of the Flambeau with many a green monument to bygone days. The hardwood logging came much later. In fact, the last big hardwood company pulled steel on its last logging railroad only a decade ago. All that remains of that company today is a land office in its ghost town, selling off its cutovers to hopeful settlers. Thus died an epoch in American history, the epoch of cut out and get out. Like a coyote rummaging in the offal of a deserted camp, the post-logging company economy of the Flambeau subsists on the leavings of its own past. Jippo pulp woodcutters nose around in the slashings for the occasional small hemlock overlooked in the main logging. A portable sawmill crew dredges the riverbed for sunken deadheads, many of which drowned during the hell for the leather log drives of the glory days. Rows of these mud-stained corpses are drawn up on shore at the old landings, all in perfect condition, and some of great value, for no such pine exists in the Northwood today. Post and pole cutters strip the swamp of white cedar. The deer follow them around and strip the felled tops of their foliage. Everybody and everything subsists on leavings. So complete are all these scavengings that when the modern cottage builder builds a log cabin, he uses imitation logs sawed out of the slab piles in Idaho or Oregon and hauled to Wisconsin woods in a freight car. The proverbial coals to Newcastle seem a mild irony compared to this. Yet there remains the river, in a few spots hardly changed since Paul Bunyan's day. At early dawn, before the motorboats awaken, one can still hear it singing in the wilderness. There are a few sections of uncut timber, luckily state-owned, and there was a considerable amount of remnant of wildlife. Muskellunge, bass, and sturgeon in the river, mergansers, black ducks, and wood ducks breeding in the sloughs, ospreys, eagles, and ravens cruising overhead. Everywhere are deer, perhaps too many. I counted 52 in 2 days afloat. A wolf or two still roam the upper Flambeau, and there was a trapper who claims he saw a marten, though no marten's skin has come out of the Flambeau since 1900. Using these remnants of the wilderness as a nucleus, the State Conservation Department began in 1943 to rebuild a 50-mile stretch of river as a wild area for the use and enjoyment of young Wisconsin. This wild stretch is set in a matrix of state forest, but there is to be no forestry on the riverbanks and as few road crossings as possible. Slowly, patiently, and sometimes expensively, the Conservation Department has been buying land, removing cottages, warding off unnecessary roads, and in general pushing the clock back, as far as possible, towards the original wilderness. The good soil that enabled the Flambeau to grow the best cork pine for Paul Bunyan likewise enabled Rusk County during recent decades to sprout a dairy industry. These dairy farmers wanted cheaper electric power than that offered by local power companies, hence they organized a cooperative, REA, and in 1947 applied for a power dam, which, when built, would clip off the lower reaches of a 50-mile stretch in process of restoration as canoe water. There was a sharp and bitter political fight. The legislature, sensitive to the farmer pressure but oblivious of wilderness values, not only approved the REA dam, but deprived the Conservation Commission of any future voice in the disposition of power sites. It thus seems likely that the remaining canoe water on the Flambeau, as well as every other stretch of wild river in the state, will ultimately be harnessed for power. Perhaps our grandsons, having never seen a wild river, will never miss the chance to set a canoe in singing waters. Deadening. The old oak has been girdled and was dead. There are degrees of death in abandoned farms. Some old houses cock an eye at you as if to say, somebody will move in, wait and see. But this farm was different. Girdling the old oak to squeeze one last crop out of the barnyard has the same finality as burning the furniture to keep warm.